Formula One has a problem, and this time, it's coming from the drivers themselves. Right after the Japanese Grand Prix, multiple drivers started exposing something the FIA didn't expect. The cars are more advanced than ever, but harder to drive, less predictable, and somehow less enjoyable. And when the people inside the cockpit start saying that, that's when things get dangerous. Because this isn't one frustrated voice. This is a pattern. A growing number of drivers all pointing to the same issue. And then, the biggest name in the sport said something that changed everything. Is it worth it? That's not about one race. That's about leaving. Which means this is no longer a technical problem. This is a crisis. Because if Formula One can't satisfy its own drivers, then what exactly is it building? Subscribe now, because what's happening behind the scenes could force Formula One into its biggest change in years. At first, the FIA believed this was just another adaptation phase. New rules always create discomfort. Drivers complain. Teams struggle. Then slowly, everything falls into place. That's how Formula One has always worked. But this time, something is not aligning. Because what drivers are experiencing right now is not temporary. It's structural. And Japan exposed that completely. Because what we saw on track wasn't just drivers being slower. It was drivers being uncertain. Moments where they approached a corner and hesitated. Moments where pushing harder didn't bring confidence, it created risk. And that's not normal in Formula One. Because at the highest level, drivers don't hesitate. They commit. They trust the car. They feel the limit and go beyond it. But now, that feeling is disappearing. Because the car is no longer something you fully understand. It's something you manage. Energy systems, battery deployment, thermal windows, all happening at once. All affecting performance in ways that are not always predictable. And that creates a dangerous situation. Because when a driver doesn't fully trust what the car will do, he stops pushing. Not consciously, but instinctively. And that's exactly what we're starting to see. But here's the detail that changed everything inside the FIA. Because this isn't happening to one driver. It's happening to many. Different teams. Different setups. Same reaction. The car doesn't behave the way it should. And when multiple drivers say the same thing, it stops being feedback. It becomes proof. Proof that something deeper is wrong. But now, let's go one level further. Because the real issue is not just unpredictability. It's what that unpredictability replaces. Control. Because Formula One has always been about control. The ability to dominate the car. To extract performance with precision. To feel exactly what's happening beneath you. But now, that control is being shared. Between driver and system. And that changes the entire balance. Because the driver is no longer the only one deciding. The car is deciding too. Through energy limits. Through software. Through restrictions that shape how you drive every single lap. And once that happens, the role of the driver starts to shrink. Not visibly, but fundamentally. And that's the part drivers are starting to reject. Because they don't just want to be fast. They want to feel responsible for that speed. But here's where it becomes critical. Because this frustration is no longer emotional. It's logical. Drivers are starting to understand exactly what they don't like. And they're expressing it clearly. Not in anger, but in analysis. And that makes it much harder to ignore. Because now, this is not a complaint. It's a diagnosis. A diagnosis that points directly at the regulations. At the core of the sport. And once that happens, the pressure shifts completely. Because now, the question is no longer, can drivers adapt? It's, should they have to? And that's where the situation becomes impossible for the FIA to control. Because once drivers stop asking how to adapt, and start questioning why they should adapt at all, everything changes. Because Formula One has always worked on one silent agreement. The drivers adjust. No matter the rules. No matter the difficulty. They find a way. But now, that agreement is breaking. Because this time, the drivers are not just struggling. They're resisting. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly. Through what they say. Through how they drive. Through the way they talk about the sport. And that resistance is far more dangerous than frustration. Because frustration can be solved. Resistance has to be addressed. But here's where the FIA's problem becomes even more complex. Because the drivers are not wrong. The regulations are doing exactly what they were designed to do. More hybrid power. More efficiency. More control over energy. Technically, it's a success. But emotionally, it's failing. And Formula One cannot survive on technical success alone. Because this sport is built on feeling. On intensity. On the connection between driver and machine. And right now, that connection is fading. But here's the part that makes this even more critical. Because once drivers lose that connection, they start looking for it somewhere else. And we've already seen signs of that. Drivers exploring other categories, talking about different types of racing, comparing experiences. And those comparisons are dangerous. Because for the first time in years, Formula One is not automatically winning. Now, it has to compete. But now we reach the moment the FIA cannot avoid. Because sooner or later, they have to decide. Do they protect the current vision of the sport? Or do they bring the drivers back into the center of it? Because right now, those two things are moving in opposite directions. And that's not sustainable. But here's the final truth. The one that explains why this situation feels so serious. Because this is not just about rules. It's about trust. Drivers need to believe that what they're driving represents the best version of racing. And when that belief disappears, everything else follows. Performance drops, motivation fades, and eventually, commitment breaks. And once that happens, you're no longer fixing a problem. You're trying to save a sport. Because if the drivers themselves stop believing in Formula One, then the real danger is not what they say. It's what they decide to do next. And by the time those decisions become public, the FIA won't be reacting to a problem anymore. They'll be facing the consequences of it. And that's when everything reaches a point of no return. Because once consequences begin, they don't wait. They don't slow down. They accelerate. And Formula One is dangerously close to that moment. Because what started as discomfort turned into frustration, then into clarity. And now, it's turning into action. Quiet action. But action that changes everything. Because drivers are no longer just talking about the problem. They're adjusting their behavior around it. Driving differently. Taking fewer risks. Holding back in moments where, before, they would have attacked. And that shift is subtle. But it's massive. Because Formula One is built on extremes. On drivers pushing beyond limits. On moments where commitment defines everything. But if that commitment starts to disappear, the entire spectacle changes. Not suddenly, but gradually. Until one day, it doesn't feel the same anymore. But here's where it becomes even more dangerous. Because this doesn't just affect racing. It affects perception. How fans experience the sport. How teams evaluate performance. How the entire ecosystem reacts. Because if drivers are no longer pushing at 100%, then what we're watching is no longer the true limit of Formula One. It's a controlled version of it. And that's not what this sport was built on. But now, everything leads to the final breaking point. Because if the FIA doesn't act, if the regulations remain unchanged, if the disconnect continues to grow, then the next phase is inevitable. Drivers won't just adapt differently. They'll start making decisions. Career decisions. Choices about where they want to race. What they want to feel. What they want their future to look like. And that's when the damage becomes irreversible. Because losing performance is one thing. Losing drivers is something else entirely. But here's the final realization. The one that connects everything we've uncovered. Because this was never just about bad adaptation. It was about misalignment. Between what the sport is becoming and what drivers actually want. And when that gap becomes too large, it doesn't close on its own. It forces change. One way or another. Because either the FIA adjusts the sport to fit the drivers, or the drivers adjust their future away from the sport. And if it reaches that point, then what we're witnessing right now is not just a difficult phase. It's the moment Formula One lost control of its own direction. And the moment the drivers started taking it back. And when that happens, the power shifts completely. Because Formula One has always been controlled from the top. Regulations define the cars. The FIA defines the direction. Teams follow. Drivers adapt. That's how the system has always worked. But now, that order is starting to reverse. Because for the first time in years, drivers are no longer at the end of the chain. They're moving to the center of it. Not officially. Not structurally. But in influence. Because when enough drivers align on the same issue, they become impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what is starting to form. A unified pressure. Not organized. Not declared. But real. Because the message is consistent. The sport is moving away from what made it special. And that message is getting louder. Race after race. Interview after interview. Until it reaches a point where silence is no longer an option. But here's where the situation becomes even more intense. Because once drivers gain that level of influence, they don't just ask for change. They shape it. Through meetings. Through the Drivers' Association. Through direct pressure on teams and the FIA. And that's when the balance of power starts to shift. Because now, the FIA is no longer leading alone. They're reacting. And reacting in Formula One is always more difficult than leading. Because now every decision feels forced. Every change feels like a response, not a vision. But here's the part that defines everything. Because if the drivers succeed in forcing that change, then the sport evolves in a new direction. One that brings back connection, instinct, control. But if they don't, if the FIA resists, if the current path continues, then the outcome is very different. Because drivers won't keep pushing forever. At some point, they stop fighting the system and start leaving it, quietly, individually, but with impact. And that's the scenario Formula One cannot afford. Because losing one driver is manageable. Losing belief across the grid is not. But now, everything leads to the final, unavoidable reality. This is no longer about whether the rules are right or wrong. It's about who defines the future of the sport, the FIA, or the drivers themselves. Because whichever side takes control next, will decide what Formula One becomes. And if that control slips away from the FIA, then what we're watching right now is not just a crisis. It's a transfer of power. A moment where the drivers stopped adapting and started deciding. And once that shift is complete, Formula One will never feel the same again.